Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the second broadcast of Voice of Rohingya Radio. I am your host, Zach Taylor. This program comes to you from the state of Oregon in the United States of America with the assistance of the GRC, the Global Rohingya Center, the ANA, the Arakan News Network, and the ARU, the Arakan Rohingya Union, and with the efforts of Dr. Waqar Uden, Director General, and Riza Uden, Director of Media Operations for the ARU, who we thank today for helping us to realize this program. Today is the 13th of April, 2014, and thank you for joining us at Voice of Rohingya Radio. I would first like to thank all of our listeners last week. Your support garnered well over 500 listens worldwide with our very first broadcast, and we've received excellent feedback from our well-wishers and listeners. We'd like to also express our appreciation to the Burmese Rohingya Association in Japan, the Burmese Rohingya community in Australia, and the Burmese Rohingya Association of the United Arab Emirates for their support. We begin today in Washington, D.C., where the 8th Conference on Global Governance was held under the theme of Dynamics of Democracy this Friday. 8 honorable speakers from various organizations spoke at the event. The Director General of the Arakan Rohingya Union elaborated on the transition to democracy in Burma, with respect to ethnic rights and with emphasis on the Rohingya ethnic minority in Arakan State in the west, and the Kaching, Karen, and other ethnic groups in East Burma. It was explained that the Rohingya and others are not only facing major human rights violations, ethnic cleansing, and genocide by some definitions, but are also facing major security issues where the radical Buddhist mobs and monks are committing violent attacks against them in Arakan State and the Pathi Myanmar Muslims in central Burma. The Director General also pointed out that prior to the attacks of NGO offices by radical Buddhist mobs, the Burmese government had ordered the closure of the Office of Doctors Without Borders, known as MSF, cutting off much of the needed medical aid. He also stressed that the government's constant denial of violence against the Rohingya is a grave matter of concern. An update on U.S. House Resolution 418 today, the bill concerning Rohingya citizenship and human rights is progressing in an advanced stage in Washington. The Arakan Rohingya Union and Just Consulting have been working closely with various sectors in Washington to bring the resolution to the House floor for the full vote. The breaching of the agreement on the census with the United Nations Population Fund and donors by the Burmese government has necessitated the rapid move on the resolution. Further work on H.R. 418 is likely to resume after the House members return to Congress after their 2-week recess. The Arakan Rohingya Union announced the opening of their ARU Secretariat branch office in Washington. The office is located in the suburb at 500 North Washington Street, Alexandria, Virginia. The new office is in close proximity to central locations in Washington and will facilitate the interactions between the ARU and various institutions in Washington.
Arkanor ador zati Aranogori pata pati Ettefaq taki arazuri Afe kamiya bir gerandi Arkanor ador zati Aranogori pata pati Ettefaq taki arazuri Afe kamiya bir gerandi Arkanor ador zati
Our top story today is the United Nations Population Fund's ongoing Myanmar census, which has stirred up more ethnic turmoil in the country. The Myanmar Times reported on Monday that the census was doomed from the start and claimed the UN perceived problems before it even began. The article said that donors and the UN had more than enough warning of the likely problems but did little to act on them. In particular, a risk assessment commissioned by donors clearly warned of many of the problems facing the program now, including flawed data and the inflaming of ethnic tensions. The chief complaint is on the question of ethnicity, and the problems are not confined to Rakhine State, where entire villages were passed over by enumerators because citizens who had been told that they may self-identify as Rohingya had found that they were only allowed to identify as Bengali. Ms. Dove from TNI said, "Regrettably, criticisms have been ignored and difficulties have been treated as technical problems with simple one-size-fits-all solutions." The Economist called the census ill-conceived in its article last Saturday, saying it threatens potentially disastrous consequences for communal relations in a country of bewildering ethnic diversity. It said the trouble lies in the census's use of an eccentric list of 135 recognized nationalities inherited from the British colonialists and incorporated into the 1982 citizenship law. Of the census's many inaccurate or debatable features, the most egregious is the exclusion of the Rohingyas, of whom Myanmar has over 1 million. Rohingyas were assured that they could identify themselves as such in the census by telling the census taker to write it in. Predictably, this prompted a backlash from the Rakhians, who believed that the Rohingyas' unwelcomed presence would become permanent if enumerated in the census. The Economist wrote that the supposedly reformist president, Thein Sein, has been pandering to Buddhist zealotry and to other anti-Muslim prejudice, and that the prejudice has encompassed other Burmese Muslims as well as the Rohingyas. On the Myanmar president's questionable character, the article cited the Myanmar parliament's upcoming consideration of a law that would ban Buddhist women from marrying non-Buddhists. The president has argued the law is needed to, quote, preserve race and religion, end quote. The Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the United Nations offered further concerns about the census. The UN Special Reporter in Myanmar, Thomas Quintada, stressed, quote, the government's decision against self-identification of the Rohingya for the census is not in compliance with the international human rights standards, and that self-identification should constitute a pillar of the collection of ethnically disaggregated data. The Nation said on Tuesday that census workers who are accompanied by armed police leave if a respondent says he or she is Rohingya. In Myanmar's eastern Khetching state, census workers are having difficulty negotiating access to areas controlled by the Khetching Independence Organization, which could leave out several hundreds of thousands of people. A specialist on Myanmar's economy, Professor Sean Turnell, remarked that the conflict areas are, quote, already critically underserved, and that the big danger is the groups that need to be counted will continue to be underrepresented. One of our sources from inside the Myanmar border offered the following cry for help in an email yesterday, which we paraphrased as follows. In clear violation of the census law, the government is threatening and intimidating us to confess as Bengalis. Here in Rangoon and other cities, they are openly telling us they will confiscate all of our properties and will deport us to Arakan if we insist to identify as Rohingyas. In the Rohingya minority areas of Arakan, they are even threatening by blocking water, food, and medicine supplies. Why are they so eager to make us as Bengalis? It is crystal clear that they have a sinister motive behind this. In 1993, they seized all of our national registration certificates and issued temporary resident permits instead. After 21 years, they are now alleging we are illegal Bengali immigrants. Recently, a motion has been passed in both houses to bar the temporary resident permit holders from politics. It is a step to disenfranchise us. They have a plan to destroy us from our ancestral homeland for good, and it is being carried out systematically and phase by phase. Our source finally asks, who will help us, and what is our crime?
Arkane arare daker guzuri guzuri naloi jogoi tora turi ar nogori oderi আর নগরীও দেরি আর কানে আরারে ডাকের গুজুরি গুজুরি নালই জগই তরা তুরি আর নগরীও দেরি আর নগরীও দেরি আর কানে আরারে ডাকের গুজুরি গুজুরি নালই জগই তরা তুরি আর নগরীও দেরি আর নগরীও দেরি
I'd like to now turn our attention to the humanitarian aid crisis still affecting internally displaced peoples in Myanmar. The Associated Press's Robin McDowell wrote on Tuesday that severe shortages of food, water, and medical care for Rohingya Muslims in western Myanmar could amount to, quote, crimes against humanity, end quote. Since June 2012, up to 280 people have been killed and tens of thousands have been forced to flee their homes. Most of the victims have been Rohingya, living in apartheid-like conditions in camps just outside the city of Sittoy. Emergency medical services have come to a near standstill since the government kicked Doctors Without Borders out of the state in February, AP argues in part because the Nobel Prize-winning group hired Rohingya staff. Violence against and intimidation of aid workers helped lead to the subsequent evacuation of more than 170 international aid workers last month. A UN envoy urged Myanmar to allow the return of aid groups forced to flee attacks in Rakhine State, Reuters reported on Monday. Aid groups have long drawn the ire of some Rakhine Buddhists who accuse them of favoring the Rohingya, who make up the vast majority of the victims of the sectarian violence. Every day that goes by, there's an increased chance of people dying because they don't have access to medical services, said Pierre Perron, spokesperson for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, adding that the clock is ticking. AFP News elaborated that the exodus of aid workers has deepened an already dire health situation for more than 140,000 in camps, as well as more than 700,000 vulnerable people in isolated villages. The outspoken UN envoy, who is approaching the end of his 6-year tenure, urged the government to address systematic discrimination and marginalization of the Rohingya in his final report on the country. One reporter inside Myanmar warned this month that the alleged rape and murder of a Rakhine woman by a local Muslim man in May of 2012, which was instrumental in catalyzing the ensuing sectarian violence, seems to have been a coup to justify violent campaigns against ethnic minorities across the country. The examining doctor was heard to say that not only was there absolutely no evidence of rape on the woman's body, but that he was forced to sign the medical report which falsely claims that she was raped. The report found that the man accused of the crimes was neither Rohingya or Muslim for that fact. Further inquiry with the accused cannot be conducted, however, as the police announced that he had committed suicide shortly after his arrest. An interview with the accused's wife was also impossible because she was found dead in their village less than a month after the incident. The article suggests that the radical Buddhist group 969 is nothing but a proxy for the Burmese government and is demanding news organizations to look into the events surrounding the Rakhine woman's death. The Irrawaddy reported on the Myanmar government's national ceasefire talks out of Rangoon on Monday, saying that the government would draw from the ethnic group's ceasefire proposal and from the government's proposal. But as discussions entered into a third day, it became clear that the initial plan to merge these two different proposals has been complicated by demands by the Burma Army for the incorporation of its own 6-point statement into any future nationwide ceasefire deal. One delegate said, "We do not think just after signing a ceasefire agreement our area will have peace. There are many things to do in order to have peace in our area. If we could reach an agreement soon, that would be great. If not, this will take more time." The U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Russell, emphasized the United States' willingness to assist the Burmese government in adjusting to, quote, the new era of media openness, end quote, in meetings with Burma's Minister for Information, Aung Kyi, this Friday. "We very much welcome the end of censorship laws. We very much welcome the effort to create a legal framework that protects journalists," he said. "I did share our concern about recent cases where journalists have been arrested and imprisoned under what strike us as arcane and obsolete laws. In the latest jailing of journalists in the country, a video reporter from the Democratic Voice of Burma was sentenced on Monday to 1 year in prison for trespassing after visiting a government education office during office hours and attempting to conduct an interview. 4 more journalists and the chief executive of Rangoon-based Unity Journal are now on trial for allegedly violating the Official Secrets Act after reporting on an alleged chemical weapons factory in the country, while a reporter at 11 Media Group was sentenced to 3 months in jail in December for defamation and trespass after writing a story about corruption in the judicial system. The desperate situation in Myanmar drew some international support this week as Minister in the Prime Minister's Department for Malaysia maintained that his government was most humane to Rohingya refugees, although it has not signed the United Nations Convention. There are currently over 130,000 UNHCR card-holding refugees in the country, but even with the government's concern for the plight of the Rohingya, the minister said it could not grant each individual with special passes to allow their stay in the country, as Malaysia would have to accept over 1 million new refugees. The Foreign Secretary in Dhaka has briefed members of the international community on the national strategy of Bangladesh to address the issue of undocumented Myanmar Rohingya. During bilateral meetings with the DGs of the International Labour Organization, the International Organization for Migration, and the World Health Organization, the Foreign Secretary also sought the cooperation of the international community for the implementation of the strategy, according to a Foreign Ministry press release yesterday. Finally, the Australian government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade weighed in on the situation last week, urging the Myanmar government to provide a safe and secure environment in Rakhine State so that all humanitarian and development personnel can continue providing their vital services. The travel advice for Burma was reissued on the 28th of March to reflect the recent violence in Rakhine State. The government continues to advise Australians to reconsider their need to travel in Rakhine State given the serious civil unrest and ongoing tensions. Australia is one of the largest bilateral humanitarian donors to Rakhine State, providing $9 million since the epidemic violence in 2012. Thank you again for listening to Voice of Rohingya Radio. You can find all of our broadcasts on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/VOR-radio, where you can also link to our Facebook page for updates on past and future programs. Stay with us in the following weeks as we interview people from around the globe who are helping with the cause, and look forward to our upcoming bi-weekly programming schedule. I'd like to close today by saying, as Myanmar moves towards democracy after decades of poverty-stricken military dictatorship, I'm reminded of the great early liberal theorists like John Locke who said, "The end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. For in all the states of created beings capable of law, where there is no law, there is no freedom." The world is watching you, Myanmar. Enact and enforce the laws needed to expand the freedom of those within your borders, for as Locke stated, where there is no law, there is no freedom. But transversely, as the world can see, where there is no freedom, there is no law. For Voice of Rohingya Radio, this is Zach Taylor, signing out.